What's going on? I'm Johnny Simonetti here with Vital MTB, and today we're talking about the all-new Pivot Phoenix downhill bike. With high pivot suspension designs taking over the World Cup in the last couple years, Pivot decided to test this for themselves by making two test mules, one with a standard DW Link layout and one with a mid-high pivot DW6 layout. Testing back-to-back confirmed a few seconds faster on Bernard Kerr's very first run on the bike, solidifying the concept and motivating Pivot to move forward with the design. It's been hard to ignore this bike over the last couple seasons for its unique lugged carbon frame and two-chain drivetrain layout. The aluminum lugs are gone, leaving behind refined carbon tubes in their place for the production version of the Phoenix downhill bike. Let's dive into some of the details. Starting with an overview of the bike, Pivot's main goal was to increase traction and control in the gnarliest sections. In order to do this, they switched over to a mid-high pivot suspension layout, utilizing the new DW6 suspension platform. By moving this main pivot up, they needed to isolate drivetrain forces. Without a main pivot to tie the idler to, this pushed Dave Weigel and Pivot into creating what they are calling the mid-drive drivetrain layout. This dual chain system uses two chain rings, with the top one being double-sided to support the secondary inboard chain, and creates the same effect as a 37-tooth chain ring. By doing this, they're actually able to reduce friction within the drivetrain while simultaneously eliminating pedal kick. This mid-drive layout is manufactured by Praxis with a proprietary chain ring and crankset. There are currently no other brands supporting this setup, although Shimano does have cranksets for the team. Whether those will become available to the public or not as these bikes get into circulation, we'll have to wait and see. You may be asking yourself, how does this fall under the DW6 patent or qualify as a 6-bar with only 5 mounting locations for pivots? And the answer is a flex stay found in the seat stay here. This was done to simplify the frame a bit and eliminate another pivot location in front of the rear axle. Pivot felt that adding a set of bearings that would only rotate 1 or 2 degrees through travel were not worth the trade-off of complexity involved with implementing it to their design. Speaking of suspension, the rear wheel travel now bumps up to 210 millimeters, maintaining the same 203 millimeter fork. The frame also comes with a whole lot more adjustability in mind. It uses the same straight 1.5 steer tube as the old bike for reach adjust headsets, which Pivot offers in a plus or minus 5 millimeter configuration. There is a flip chip found at the upper link to allow for some head tube adjustment and BB height drop, as well as a kinematic flip chip in the lower shock mount to increase or decrease the progression of the bike. As for some initial impressions, I can tell you in person this thing looks insane. The two-tone black on black paint job with some gold splatter looks really good in my opinion, and it's got a super light weight. I think it weighs less than my Enduro bike out of the box, but I'll have to throw it on a scale and confirm that. Oh, went up a little bit. I guess you can like walk. I think it's just a really well thought out build kit. Fox factory suspension front and rear, Shimano Saint group set and brakes with Galfer Shark rotors to get that 220 up front. It's also a really nice touch for that race ready feeling. DT Swiss wheel sets, bulletproof, some nice Continental downhill casing tires in their super soft compound, and Pivot in-house components round out the build kit. I think it's a super solid build kit out of the box with only a few things I would change. First couple rides on the bike, the first thing I did change was the handlebar and stem, going to something a little bit taller that I'm used to just to kind of get my weight a little further back. My weight bias did feel slightly forward when I initially started testing, and this really helped correct that. Jumping into some on-trail impressions, right off the bat, it was really comfortable fit once I got that bar height sorted out. The rear suspension has a super active feeling and really does a good job of eliminating any type of square edge bumps, and I anticipated it being kind of hard to get off the ground. This thing was pretty hard to manual in the parking lot, not the most lively feeling for some jibs, but once you get in the travel, it really lightens up and carried a really light feeling on trail overall. Felt super intuitive to ride in high speed situations, and in more technical bits, it's really confidence inspiring, but the dimensions of the bike were maybe a little cumbersome for the terrain I tested on. As I experimented more with the adjustments, flipping into the high flip chip setting really helped tighten up turns, and shortening up that front center certainly helped feel like there was a little more even pressure at both wheels. Navigating more technical sections became a bit more intuitive. I then moved on to experimenting with the kinematic flip chip, going from the more linear setting to the more progressive, and you do get a bit more feedback through the bike, but I feel like the bike recovers so well from successive hits in that setting that I opted to leave it there. This just further lightened up the bike on trail to me, just made it a lot easier to kind of get back what you put into it. Rider input was absorbed more when the bike was in its most linear and low setting, and flipping it to the high and more progressive setting certainly helped that. I experimented later in testing with going back to the low setting while keeping it in a more progressive kinematic, and that certainly gave it a much better balance. Bike didn't sit in so deep, the front didn't feel like it was so vague, it kind of got a little more pressure on that front wheel and really just seemed to keep the bike out of the holes a little better. That being said, the more linear setting of the flip chip really does eliminate pretty much everything you would encounter on most trails. Does a really good job of kind of taking the edge off everything. Flipping the bike back to the low setting later in testing really showed where that setting is meant for. The gnarliest bits of trail, I felt super confident just throwing the front wheel into. The terrain I tested on isn't very steep for very long, but on a more sustained steep descent, I could see it just feeling pretty limitless. I could imagine hitting a turn at Mount St. Anne going close to 40 miles an hour. That thing is probably awesome. The stuff I rode, that's never really happening all that often, at least not within the risks that I was willing to take on my time on the bike. But I could see it working really well for someone who does that kind of stuff regularly. The trade-off of running it in the high was that the reach grew a little bit, top tube length grows a bit, and I felt like the bars were a bit far away from me. And I think that's where the reach adjust headset is really useful. I think I would opt to run this bike in the high setting with the more progressive kinematic and then opt for the short reach adjust headset to bring that reach back in check where it was in the low setting. After making those changes, I was surprised how much the bike actually changed. While it is subtle, it was enough to really make me feel like what I was doing on the bike was connecting to the trail in a great way. The mid-drive system at the beginning of testing did loosen up a bit. I was able to contact Pivot and get an instruction manual on how to retension it. It is super straightforward. It took about 5 minutes to retension. There's just a cover here that's removable, and then on the back side there's a bolt to tighten this upper wheel. You just reach in there with a cone wrench and it's concentric, so it tensions this inner chain. After doing that, things quiet down a bit, but the cover there is plastic inside and out and does make a bit of noise while riding. I would think some mastic tape or possibly some soft-sided Velcro would quiet that thing right down and give you plenty of clearance. Certainly an interesting layout. I think one of the coolest things was you get a slightly higher clearance, or I felt like I had slightly higher clearance with that smaller chainring. Thinking I was gonna smash the chainring, it was a lot softer than what I had anticipated. So that is one added benefit, is you do get a little bit higher clearance without a higher bottom bracket height. I will say it runs dead silent when you're pedaling and there's like zero friction, and having ridden some other high pivot bikes with idlers, it is like none of that effect. It is just a dead smooth drivetrain. So I'd say the effort to create that was worth it there. This bike is coil shock compatible. I'd be interested to try it, but it is worth noting that this Float X2 is probably one of the best feeling air shocks I've ever ridden on a downhill bike. Whether that's down to the tune inside or just the kinematic they got going on, it's awesome, super supple. As for who this bike's for, I think it's clear. It's a race bike. It's for someone who wants to ride at the limit pretty often, and if your terrain is high speed and rather aggressive, it is a bike that will excel in those conditions. I found it to be super confidence inspiring in the gnarliest bits of trail. You know, some of these sections I hadn't ridden in 5-6 years and was able to just go right in and kind of pick up where I left off. So yeah, I think Pivot did a really good job with this thing. They achieved the goals they set out to. One of my concerns was that this thing would be crazy expensive, but I'm pretty stoked to see it's right around where the old Phoenix left off price-wise, and it's pretty competitive with other leading bikes in the market. They do a lower end spec that is still awesome. It's still got DT Swiss wheels, Continental tires, but you get SRAM drivetrain and brakes, as well as RockShox suspension front and rear, which is kind of exciting to see. With Pivot being, you know, synonymous with Fox and Shimano for a long time. So there's options out there. It's definitely, you know, a boutique bike from a boutique brand, but I think you're getting what you pay for. As for durability concerns, you know, it is complex. There's a lot going on there, but that being said, Pivot's hardware and tolerances I would describe as class leading. I know they take that stuff seriously, and the attention to detail shows through in this frame. There are some really cool design lines on this thing, some really sharp edges, and all the hardware uses a pretty high torque spec, which is awesome. It's really cool to tighten something and not have to worry about it for, you know, a really long time. And In my experience riding pivot bikes in the past, I've rarely had to touch anything. Yeah, there you have it. The new Pivot Phoenix downhill bike.